Questions for the NIAA. How much money did the NIAA spend on the doomed Voice referendum?
Thank you, Senator. We'll just get the right officer at the table.
Good afternoon. Senator Roberts, Simon Gordon, Group Manager of Strategy Group. I don't have that exact figure with me, but we'll be able to get that quickly this afternoon to you.
Okay. If not, well, I'll notice, yes.
Yeah.
What difference would that money have made if provided directly to local Aboriginal communities to spend on their decisions and actually make a difference?
Senator, although we don't have the figures with us, you may be aware from a previous testimony at other hearings, the majority of the expenditure on the referendum was actually with the Australian Electoral Commission. NIAA received a very small proportion of funding for issues associated with the referendum working group meetings, a civics and awareness campaign, and really, as I said, it was a very small proportion of the overall expenditure on the referendum.
Thank you. My concerns are not only with the amount of money spent, but the effectiveness on it. That's why I asked the question about whether or not it would be better spent at the communities. Let's continue. Looking at NIAA figures obtained through Freedom of Information seeking monies that NIAA spent, why are such large amounts provided to particular contractors? And I'm thinking BARPA Construction Services received almost $613 million.
So, sorry, Senator, you're referring just to overall expenditure under the Indigenous Advancement Strategy, or not related to the referendum?
No, overall money that NIAA spent. I think the previous man said something like 1,200 grants or 2,000 grants. I can't remember.
It's actually, I think that's Nick. It's for Nick.
Mr. Gray?
Shane Dexter, Branch Manager, Business and Economic Policy. Thank you for the question, Senator. I think you might be referring to some information that was released under FOI to do with the Indigenous procurement policy over the last several months. So the Indigenous procurement policy is a whole of Commonwealth policy that provides preferential procurement practices for certified for registered Indigenous businesses. BARPA Construction did ring a bell with me as one of the businesses that was released as receiving a certain amount of money.
613, I'm told.
613 million. So I believe that was an amount that BARPA has received through the Indigenous procurement policy, which is not necessarily, in fact, it's Indigenous Advancement Strategy money.
Body I need to
it's a collection. The Indigenous procurement policy and the reporting under it is a collection of all of the contracts that organisation has received through the Indigenous procurement policy.
Okay. Do you know what they were paid for? If it's outside your accountability.
Yeah, no. So, Senator, I wouldn't know. That would need to be directed to the agency that engaged them.
What about Evolve FM Proprietary Limited received almost $497 million?
So that would be in the same category, Senator. That would be. There was a number of FOI requests that were made recently, which were asking for the aggregate amounts that Indigenous businesses had received through the Indigenous procurement policy over the life of the policy. And the Indigenous procurement policy is a policy that's been in place since 2015. It's resulted in about $9.5 billion going to Indigenous businesses over that period of time. And we were asked for I think one of the questions that we got under the FOI was what are the top 100 businesses that have received money through that policy. Evolve and BARPA were both on that list.
What about Waterhouse Coopers? Disgraced consultants received almost $50 million.
I'd need to check, Senator, but I would hazard a guess that it was not Waterhouse Coopers itself, but rather Waterhouse Coopers Indigenous Consulting, which is a separate entity.
If you could check
I'd be happy to take that on notice. Yeah.
What was the total amount of NIAA money spent over the 8-year period to companies providing contract services?
I think we'll have to get some other colleagues up for that, Senator.
Okay.
Procurement.
Sorry, Senator, could you repeat that question?
Sure. What was the total amount of NIAA money spent, that total amount that NIAA spent over that 8-year period to companies providing contract services? That's the 8 years to January 2024.
Senator Rachel Jackson, Chief Operating Officer. I don't know if we've got the 8-year amounts with us. We'd have the last couple of years, but which we can go into if you like. But otherwise, we can take it on notice.
Well, take it on notice and have the 8. Thank you. Presumably, it's several millions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars. So, with that kind of money and other monies being injected into the Aboriginal wellbeing, why is the gap not being closed?
So, Senator, clearly the evidence is that there is gaps in outcomes for First Nations people.
Yeah.
And closing the gap is designed and has been designed with our partners, particularly Coalition Peaks, but all states and territories, to address those gaps. I think I'm a little bit confused by your question in terms of there's some spending here, so that would have changed the outcomes over there, because there obviously is different outcomes depending on different areas of government as well. So there is, I'd probably like to be a bit more specific about your question.
Well, I'm concerned that there's a huge amount of money being spent and it's going through agencies, but it's not closing the gap. Why isn't it closing the gap?
So there's perhaps...
Senator, I mean, I know the majority of your questions are kind of related to, of course, what we've done under the Indigenous procurement policy. The original intention of the Indigenous procurement policy obviously was to support Indigenous businesses, because we know that, in fact, Indigenous businesses also have a higher employment rate for Indigenous people as well, First Nations people. As Mr Dexter has said, we've had a lot of success with that, over 65,000 contracts with a total value of $9.5 billion worth of business going to First Nations business as a result of that Indigenous procurement policy. You may be aware, of course, that in fact the Assistant Minister launched a review of the Indigenous procurement policy back in December. We opened up a consultation process for that review. It closed, I think, around March of this year. We're going to take the learnings, obviously, from all of that and see what further improvements we can actually make to continue, I think, what has been a success story just in relation to the generation of Indigenous business and creation of Indigenous employment.
So you're telling me there's been a review of money spent given to Indigenous businesses. What I would like to know is there a review being conducted, or any idea of a review to be conducted on spending of all kinds?
So, Senator,
could that money instead be going directly to the communities to develop accountability and autonomy? Because communities are screaming out for autonomy.
Senator, as I indicated, in fact, this a review and consultation was really to see about how we further strengthen the Indigenous procurement policy, because, as I mentioned, it has been very successful in awarding business to First Nations businesses and creating employment opportunities for First Nations people.
And I acknowledge that, and thank you. I acknowledge that and said, can you extend it to a review of all spending? And specifically, can you send the money direct to the communities and bypass the agencies?
So, Senator, the money associated with the Indigenous procurement policy is basically services contracted across all of government, and then it's for each agency to decide, in fact, whether they're seeking to procure services from businesses, including First Nations businesses. Obviously, the Indigenous procurement policy has a mandatory set-aside for First Nations businesses as part of that policy, which applies across government agencies. And so there has been an interest in the community more broadly about what can be done to further enhance that particular policy, and that's the purpose of the review.
I acknowledge that twice. Chair, I acknowledge that twice, but what I'd like to know, is there any consideration being given to reviewing expenditure across NIAA? not just on procurement.
So, Senator, obviously spending on Indigenous outcomes, and this is why we have the cross-portfolio here, cuts across all of government to deliver outcomes in specific portfolio areas and specific policy areas. In NIAA, obviously, we have the IAS, a large part of which has been employment services. Another part is ranger services, and to your point, that goes particularly to communities on the ground. So it is focused on those sorts of things, and then there's a whole range of other programs that are supplementary to mainstream funding. But these are services that citizens are entitled to. So it depends how you quantify the spending, but the different programs are there to deliver different outcomes for Indigenous people, and we could go into the programs that are specifically I suppose, designed with community and go directly to community as well, because there is a lot of those sorts of programs as well. They're not all being delivered through departments, but on the ground as well.
Thank you. We'll continue this in the future.